The Duke's Unwanted Betrothal. Chapter 1. The Binding. The first thing the Duke of Northridge registered upon waking was not the pale morning light filtering through the damask curtains, nor the distant sound of servants stirring in the great house. It was the weight of a piece of parchment on his chest, placed there with deliberate intent. He'd been dreaming of a horse race, of wind and speed, and this crisp, crackling intrusion had anchored him back to reality. With a groan, he reached for it. Julian Thorne, 6th Duke of Northridge, was not a man accustomed to being surprised. At 32, he ran his vast estates with an efficiency that bordered on ruthless, navigated the treacherous currents of the Tun with a practiced mask of affable indifference, and kept his heart in a vault to which only he had the key. Surprises were invariably unpleasant. This one was no exception. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, but the script was sharp and clear. It was a copy of a marriage contract, dated 25 years prior. His father's sprawling signature was at the bottom, next to that of one Percival Grey, a baron he vaguely recalled as a boisterous, red-faced man who'd died in a hunting accident when Julian was at Eton. Julian's own name was written in a childish hand in the margin. The name of the intended bride, however, was the crux of the matter. Lady Eleanor Grey. He read the document 3 times, the meaning slowly seeping through the fog of his sleep-addled mind. The estates of Northridge and the Greys' modest holding had shared a boundary for centuries. This contract, a final grandiose gesture of friendship between 2 old fools, bound their children in matrimony. A merger of lands and bloodlines. A dynastic fantasy cooked up over too much port. And, as the final paragraph confirmed, it was legally binding. The terms had been triggered. Both fathers were dead. Julian was the Duke. And Lady Eleanor Grey, having reached the age of 25 as stipulated, was now, by law, his betrothed. A cold, sharp fury began to kindle in his chest. He was a man who chose his own path. He chose his own horses, his own wines, his own mistresses. To be shackled to a stranger, a woman he'd never met, because of the whims of a dead man was an outrage. He had plans, ambitions for his land, for agricultural reform. He did not have wife on that list. He certainly did not have love. He threw the parchment onto the bedside table and rang for his valet. An hour later, immaculate in a dark blue coat and cream breeches, he sat in his study, the document now lying on the vast mahogany desk before him. His solicitor, a thin, meticulous man named Grimshaw, stood before him, his face a study in professional apology. "There is no recourse, Your Grace." Julian's voice was deceptively calm. Grimshaw shook his head. "I have examined it myself twice. It is watertight. The clauses, the witnesses, the seals, all in order. It is, for all intents and purposes, a legal betrothal. Failure to comply would result in a significant portion of the Northridge lands, the eastern parcel, the one bordering the Grey estate, being forfeited to the Grey family as compensation." Julian's jaw tightened. The eastern parcel contained his most promising experimental farm. He would not lose it. He would not be dictated to. But he also would not be made a fool. "Who is she?" he asked, his tone clipped. "This Lady Eleanor Grey, what do we know of her?" Grimshaw consulted his notes. "She is the only child of the late Baron Grey. She has managed the Grey estate, Thornwood Hall, since her father's death some 7 years ago. She lives there quietly with a small household. She is not known in London. She does not attend the season." Not known? Julian's eyebrow arched. A young, unmarried woman of noble birth who shunned the marriage mart. It was peculiar. Is she deformed? An invalid? Eccentric? "The reports, Your Grace, are simply that she is private. She has a reputation for being astute with the estate's accounts. She dismissed the land agent her father had employed and manages the tenants herself." This was intriguing, despite himself. A woman who managed her own land? It was unheard of. Perhaps she was a bluestocking, more interested in crop rotation than courtship. That might be a relief. A quiet, sensible arrangement. A marriage in name only, perhaps. He could install her at Northridge, give her a wing of her own, and continue his life largely unchanged. "Very well," Julian said, rising. "I will go to Thornwood Hall myself. This situation requires a personal negotiation." He did not send word ahead. He wanted to see her and the state of her land without the benefit of a prepared welcome. It was a 2-hour ride from Northridge, through fields he knew as well as his own face, and then over a small stone bridge that marked the boundary. The grey land was different. It was neat. The hedgerows were trimmed, the fences were in good repair, and the tenant cottages he passed had fresh whitewash and smoke curling cheerfully from their chimneys. It was a picture of quiet, prosperous order. It was not what he expected from an estate managed by a lone woman. Thornwood Hall itself was a handsome Elizabethan manor built of warm, honey-coloured stone. It was smaller than Northridge, but it was loved. Wisteria climbed its walls, and the gardens were a profusion of late summer colour, clearly tended with care, but not the rigid formality of a French parterre. It felt like a home, not a monument. He dismounted and handed his reins to a young groom who appeared with prompt efficiency. At the heavy oak door, he was met by a stern-looking housekeeper. "The Duke of Northridge to see Lady Eleanor Grey," he announced, his tone brooking no delay. The housekeeper's eyes widened a fraction before she composed her features. "Your Grace, please wait in the drawing-room. I shall inform her ladyship." He was shown into a comfortable, sun-filled room. It was not grand, but it was inviting. Books were piled on side tables, a basket of mending sat by the window, and a vase of freshly cut dahlias from the garden stood on the piano. This was a room that was lived in. He was studying a particularly interesting title on crop rotation when he heard a light footstep in the hall. He turned, and the world tilted, just slightly, on its axis. Lady Eleanor Grey was not deformed. She was not an invalid. She was not a reclusive eccentric. She was, quite simply, the most arresting woman he had ever seen. She was tall for a woman, with a figure that was slender and strong, not cinched into the fashionable wasp waist. Her hair was a rich, deep chestnut, pinned up in a simple, practical style that allowed a few rebellious curls to frame her face. But it was her face that held him. High cheekbones, a mouth that looked like it was more accustomed to smiling than simpering, and eyes the colour of a stormy sea, grey-green and direct. They were not the eyes of a shy maiden. They were the eyes of someone who assessed, calculated and judged, and right now they were filled with cold, polite inquiry, not a trace of the flutterings a duke's unexpected presence usually caused. "Your Grace," she said, her voice low and melodic. "This is an unexpected honour. To what do I owe the visit?" He found his voice, cursing the slight delay. "Lady Eleanor, my apologies for the intrusion without notice. A matter of some urgency has arisen." "Indeed?" She gestured for him to sit, taking a chair opposite him, her posture straight and composed. She did not simper or blush. She waited. He reached into his coat and produced the copy of the contract. He held it out to her. "I believe you may be familiar with this." She took it, her expression unchanging as she read it. She did not gasp or cry out or turn pale. She simply read it, her brow furrowing slightly in concentration. When she finished, she looked up at him, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. It was not happiness. It was not surprise. It was grim resignation, laced with steel. "So," she said quietly, laying the paper on the table between them, "my father's final folly comes to roost." She looked directly at him. "I assume you have had it verified. It is, as you see, legally binding." "It is," Julian confirmed, leaning forward. "Which is why I am here. This situation is not of my making, Lady Eleanor. I assure you, I had no knowledge of this contract until this morning. I am as much a victim of our father's sentimentality as you are." A strange, fleeting expression crossed her face. Was it amusement? "A victim, Your Grace," she murmured. "How poetic." He pressed on. "I am a practical man. I propose we be practical about this. The law demands we marry, but the law does not demand we live as husband and wife, not in the true sense. I have a large estate. You have a small one. We can come to a mutually beneficial arrangement, a marriage of convenience." He watched her, waiting for the relief to flood her features, for the eager acceptance of a duchess's coronet. He was offering her wealth, status, security. What woman in her right mind would refuse? Lady Eleanor Grey rose from her chair. She walked to the window and looked out at her gardens, at her home, for a long moment. When she turned back to him, her face was set in an expression of immovable resolve. "No," she said. The single word hung in the air, as sharp and unexpected as a thunderclap on a clear day. Julian blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "I refuse the match, Your Grace." He stood up, frowning. "You refuse. Lady Eleanor, you cannot refuse. It is a legal bond. If we do not marry, I lose a significant portion of my land, and you gain it. Is that what you want? To take my land?" "I do not want your land," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "I do not want your title. I do not want a marriage of convenience or any other kind, with you or anyone else." "But why?" The question was torn from him, driven by genuine, baffled curiosity. "Why would you refuse this? I am not a cruel man. I would ensure your comfort. You would be a duchess. You would have wealth, position, everything a woman of your station could possibly desire." She looked at him then, and her gaze was pitying. It was a look he had never received from a woman before, and it stung more than any insult. "Everything a woman of my station could desire," she repeated softly. "Tell me, Your Grace, what do you imagine that to be?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. He had never actually considered it. Security, a home, a respected position in society. "I have a home," she said, gesturing to the room around them. "I have security. I have worked for 7 years to build it. Thornwood Hall is mine. It is not entailed. I run it. I make the decisions. The tenants come to me with their problems. I know every field, every cow, every family by name." She took a step towards him, her passion breaking through her calm facade. "If I marry you, I become your property. My land becomes yours. My voice, my choices, my very self. They would all be subsumed into the great Duke of Northridge. I would trade a life of purpose for a life of gilded irrelevance. I would be an ornament, a broodmare, a hostess for your parties." "That is not what he started. "Is it not?" she challenged. "You spoke of a marriage of convenience. A convenient arrangement for whom? For you. You would carry on as before, unencumbered, while I would be expected to manage your household, smile at your guests, and be grateful for the privilege. I have spent my entire adult life fighting to be the master of my own fate. I will not surrender it now, not for a coronet, and not for you." She was magnificent. In her righteous anger, her fierce independence, she was the most beautiful creature he had ever seen. And he had just been thoroughly, completely, and eloquently rejected. He stood there, the powerful Duke of Northridge, utterly speechless. He had come to negotiate, to offer terms. He had not anticipated a battle of wills, and he had certainly not anticipated losing. "The land, Lady Eleanor," he finally managed, his voice hoarse. "If you refuse, the law forces me to forfeit it. Is that truly your wish?" For the first time, a flicker of something else, regret, perhaps, crossed her face. "No," she admitted quietly. "It is not my wish. It is my father's wish, and yours, written on a piece of paper years before I had any say in my own life. I do not want your land, but I will not be bought with it. She took a breath, regaining her composure. There must be another way, a legal loophole, a delay. I suggest you find it, Your Grace. Until then, I wish you a good day. It was a dismissal. He, a duke, was being dismissed from a modest manor house by a baron's daughter. He bowed stiffly, a lifetime of protocol carrying him through the motion. Lady Eleanor. As he rode back to Northridge, the image of her storm-grey eyes, blazing with defiant life, was seared into his memory. He was still furious. He was still trapped. But beneath the fury, a new and unwelcome feeling was taking root. Intrigue. For the first time in his carefully ordered life, Julian Thorne had met something he could not easily control, and he found he desperately wanted to understand it. Chapter 2. The Education of a Duke. The following week was one of the most frustrating of Julian's life. He threw himself into the search for a legal loophole, summoning Grimshaw daily, consulting ancient texts on marital law, even sending an emissary to a renowned barrister in London. The answer, each time, was the same. The contract was iron. The land would be forfeit if the marriage did not take place by the end of the quarter, a mere 2 months away. But his mind was not truly on the legalities. It was on Thornwood Hall. On the woman in the sunlit room who had looked at him as if he were a problem to be solved, not a prize to be won. Her words had burrowed under his skin like thorns. An ornament, a broodmare, a hostess for your parties. Was that truly how the world looked to a woman of intelligence and spirit? He had never considered it. Women of his acquaintance were preoccupied with fashion, gossip, and securing the best match. He had dismissed them as trivial. He had never considered that their triviality might be a cage, not a choice. A few days after his visit, on impulse, he rode back towards the grey estate. He didn't go to the house. Instead, he skirted the boundary and rode through the fields he had admired before. He saw her almost immediately. She was in a far field, walking alongside a tenant farmer, her skirts kilted up practically to avoid the mud. She was examining a sheep the man held, her hands gentle as she felt its fleece, her head bent close to his as they talked. She laughed at something the man said, a genuine, unrestrained sound that carried on the breeze. It was a different woman from the one who had faced him in her drawing room. This woman was at ease, competent, and utterly in her element. He was about to turn away, feeling like an interloper, when she looked up and saw him. She froze for a moment, then said something to the farmer, who led the sheep away. She walked towards the fence where he sat on his horse, her expression wary. "Your Grace," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "Are you lost?" "No," he admitted, dismounting. "I was riding. I saw you. I wanted to apologize." Her eyebrows shot up. "Apologize?" "For my behavior at our last meeting. I came to your home, uninvited, and presented you with a legal summons as if it were a proposal. I spoke of a practical arrangement without once considering your feelings on the matter. It was arrogant and insensitive. I am sorry." She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to determine if he was being sincere or if this was some new, sophisticated form of attack. "That is a very handsome apology, Your Grace." "Julian," he said, "please, if we are to be unwillingly bound by law, we might at least be on first-name terms." She hesitated, then a small smile touched her lips. "Julian, and I am Eleanor, or Nell to my friends." "Nell?" He tried the name. It suited her. "May I walk with you?" She nodded, and they began to walk along the edge of the field. He was acutely aware of her beside him, of the easy, swinging stride that matched his own. "This is your doing?" he asked, gesturing to the healthy flock, the well-tended fields. "Mostly," she said. "I had a good teacher in our old steward, Mr. Higgins, before he retired. I've tried to put his lessons into practice. We've introduced new rotation crops, invested in better breeding stock for the sheep. It's slow work, but it's working. It is more than working, he said, impressed. My own eastern farm. It's my pet project. New methods of drainage, experimental wheat. I would have hated to lose it. And yet you offered to, she said quietly, glancing at him. You were willing to give up a piece of your heritage to avoid a marriage you didn't want. He stopped walking, turning to face her. I was. Just as you were willing to risk a legal battle to keep your freedom. We are perhaps more alike than I first thought. She held his gaze, and something passed between them. A flicker of understanding, of mutual respect. Perhaps, she conceded. Tell me about the drainage on your low-lying meadow, he said, changing the subject. I noticed you've dug new channels. I've been experimenting with tile drains. And so began a series of strange, unorthodox encounters. He found himself riding to Thornwood Hall with increasing frequency, always with a pretext, a book on animal husbandry to lend, a question about a new plough he'd seen, a query about a particular strain of wheat. Each time she would meet him, sometimes in the house, often out in the fields. They would walk and talk for hours. He told her about his plans for Northridge, his frustrations with the old-fashioned ways of his tenants, his dreams of turning his land into a model of agricultural efficiency. She listened, questioned, and offered insightful observations. She told him about her struggles to be taken seriously by merchants and other landowners, about the small victories, a successful lambing season, a new roof for a tenant's cottage, a particularly good yield of apples from the orchard. He saw her with her people. She was not their lady. She was their partner. She knew their children's names, remembered their ailments, celebrated their successes. They did not bow and scrape to her. They greeted her with warm smiles and easy conversation. It was a model of lordship he had never even contemplated, and it shamed him. At Northridge, he was respected, even feared. He was not loved. One afternoon, they were sitting on a fallen log at the edge of a wood, watching the sun dapple through the changing leaves. He had just explained a complex new system of crop rotation he was planning. You truly love this, don't you? He asked her. The land, the work. I do, she said simply. It's real. It's honest. A sheep doesn't care if you're a duke or a dairymaid. It only cares if you feed it and tend to it well. The land repays your effort, your intelligence, your care, 100-fold. It doesn't lie, and it doesn't judge. Unlike the ton, he said with a wry smile. Unlike the ton, she agreed, laughing. That laugh did something to his chest, a strange, tight fluttering he refused to acknowledge. Is that why you never came to London? He asked. You could have had a season. You could have had your pick of husbands. She grew serious, looking out at the fields. My mother died when I was born. My father, he was a kind man, but he was weak. He loved his pleasures more than his responsibilities. After he died, I saw the estate crumbling. The agent was robbing us blind. The tenants were desperate. I had a choice. I could sell up, go to London, and try to catch a wealthy husband, leaving all these people to an unknown fate, or I could stay and fight. She turned to him. I chose to fight, and I have never regretted it for a single moment. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just a beautiful woman, but a person of extraordinary courage and integrity. He saw the loneliness, too, hidden beneath her competent exterior. She had chosen this path, but it was a solitary one. She had no family, no peers who understood her. It must be lonely, he said softly. She met his eyes, and for a moment the mask slipped, and he saw a flicker of the vulnerability she kept so well hidden. Sometimes, she admitted. But it is my loneliness. I chose it. That night, back at Northridge, Julian stood before the portrait of his father in the great hall. The old Duke stared down at him, painted in his ceremonial robes, his expression stern and commanding. "You did this to me," Julian whispered to the canvas. "You and your foolish contract." But the anger had faded. In its place was a strange, burgeoning sense of gratitude. If not for the contract, he would never have met her. He would have continued his comfortable, shallow existence, never knowing what he was missing, never knowing her. He thought of the land forfeiture. It was no longer about the land, it was about her. He could not, would not, be the instrument of her unhappiness. Marrying her against her will, even in name only, would be a betrayal of everything he had come to admire about her. He would not cage her. He would not make her an ornament. He had to find a way to free her. And in doing so, he realized with a start, he was hoping to win the one thing he had never sought from any woman, her freely given heart. Chapter 3. The Seeds of a Solution. The idea came to him not in his study, surrounded by law books, but in the quiet of his own library as he was reading a treatise on land management. A passage about dower rights and jointures sparked a memory of a conversation he'd had with Grimshaw about the specifics of the Grey estate. The next morning he was back at Thornwood Hall. Nell met him in the drawing room, a question in her eyes. "I have an idea," he said, without preamble, his energy barely contained. "A way to fulfill the contract without you having to surrender your independence." She looked wary but intrigued. "Go on." "The contract stipulates we must marry. It says nothing about how we must live. It does not require that our property be merged. In fact, it specifically references the estates and properties held by each party at the time of the marriage." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, a rough diagram he'd sketched. "Here is Thornwood, here is Northridge. The land at risk, the eastern parcel, is adjacent to your northern boundary." He pointed. "What if, upon our marriage, Thornwood Hall and its lands were settled entirely on you, legally, irrevocably, yours, separate from any claims I or any future heirs of ours might have? A trust, managed by trustees of your choosing." Nell stared at him, her brow furrowed. "You would do that? Give up any claim to my land?" "I am not giving it up," he corrected gently. "I am ensuring it stays yours. You would continue to run it exactly as you do now. It would be your property, your income, your home. You would be my wife in name only, but in every way that matters to you, you would remain the mistress of your own fate." She was silent for a long moment, processing. "And the other aspects of marriage?" He felt a warmth creep up his neck. "They would be entirely your choice. I would never presume, that is, unless you wished. This is a legal solution, Nell. Nothing more. Unless you wanted it to be." She looked at him and her eyes were shining. Not with tears, but with a light he had never seen before. "You have been listening to me," she whispered. "Truly listening." "I have," he admitted. "I have come to admire you more than anyone I have ever known. Your strength, your intelligence, your integrity. I would be proud to call you my wife, even if it is only a piece of paper. But only if you are willing. I will not trap you. If this solution is acceptable, we marry, and you remain free. If not, I will go back to London, find a way to fight the forfeiture in the courts, and leave you in peace." He held his breath. This was it. He had laid his heart, or at least a large piece of it, at her feet. She walked to the window, her back to him. The silence stretched, taut as a wire. Finally, she turned. There were tears on her cheeks, but she was smiling. "You are a remarkable man, Julian Thorne," she said. "I have spent 7 years building walls to protect myself, and you have just dismantled them, not with a battering ram, but with a key." She took a step towards him. "Yes, I will marry you. On these terms." He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. A wave of relief, so powerful it was almost dizzying, washed over him. And with it came a surge of pure, unadulterated joy. She had said yes, not to the Duke of Northridge, but to his solution, to his respect for her. It was more than he had dared to hope for. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Grimshaw, initially horrified at the unconventional settlement, was eventually won over by its legal elegance. Trustees were appointed, a staid local banker, and, at Nell's insistence, a retired solicitor, known for his fairness. The marriage contract was redrawn, a masterpiece of legal precision that guaranteed Nell's complete financial and proprietary independence. They were married in the small ancient church on the edge of the Northridge estate. It was a quiet ceremony, witnessed only by Grimshaw, the housekeepers from both houses, and a handful of loyal servants who beamed with pride. Nell wore a simple gown of deep blue velvet that matched her eyes and a sprig of white heather in her hair. Julian thought she had never looked more beautiful. As the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Julian looked down at her. She met his gaze, and in her stormy eyes he saw not resignation, but a calm, quiet happiness. He leaned in and pressed the gentlest of kisses to her lips. It was brief, chaste, but it sent a shockwave through him. He felt her slight intake of breath, and knew she had felt it too. Afterwards, there was a simple wedding breakfast at Thornwood Hall. Nell's housekeeper had outdone herself, and the small party was filled with laughter and warm wishes. As the afternoon sun began to slant through the windows, the guests departed, leaving them alone. They stood in the drawing room, a new, strange silence between them. They were married, legally bound. Yet the gulf of uncertainty was wider than ever. "Well," Nell said, a nervous smile playing on her lips, "I suppose you will be wanting to return to Northridge." It was a dismissal, gently offered, and it struck him like a physical blow. Of course. Their agreement. She was free. He had given her that. He could not now take it back. "Yes," he said, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. "I suppose I should. There are estate matters." She nodded, her smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. "Of course. I understand." He walked towards her, took her hand, and raised it to his lips. "Good night, wife," he murmured, the word feeling both foreign and achingly right. "Good night, Julian," she whispered. He rode back to Northridge in the gathering dusk, the vast empty house looming before him. He had won. He had freed her. He had kept his land. And he had never felt more desolate in his entire life. He had given her everything she wanted, except the one thing he now realized he desperately wanted to give: himself. Chapter 4. The Harvest. The days that followed their wedding were a study in exquisite torture. Julian buried himself in work at Northridge, riding his land with a restless energy that exhausted his horses and bewildered his stewards. He threw himself into the drainage project on the eastern farm, hoping the physical labour would exhaust the ache in his chest. It did not. He saw her, of course. Their estates bordered each other, but their encounters were now formal, chaperoned by an invisible wall of politeness. He would see her in a field and raise his hand in greeting, and she would wave back, a small, distant figure. He heard from his tenants that she had visited the eastern farm, offering advice on the drainage that had proved invaluable. She was helping him, even now. The knowledge was a warm, bittersweet balm. He tried to court her. He sent her books, a new volume on sheep breeding, a collection of poetry he thought she might like. She sent back polite notes of thanks. He invited her to dine at Northridge. She came, dressed in a gown of silver grey that made her eyes luminous. They sat at opposite ends of his vast dining table, making stilted conversation about the weather and the price of wool. The distance between them was a physical pain. He realized, with a clarity that was both humbling and terrifying, that he had made a terrible miscalculation. He had given her independence, but he had also given her a reason to keep him at arm's length. He had proven that he would not push, would not presume. And she, fiercely protective of her freedom, was taking him at his word. Their agreement had become a prison of its own making. One blustery autumn afternoon, he was walking the boundary line between their estates, near the small wood where they had once sat on a fallen log. He saw her then, sitting on that very log, wrapped in a warm cloak, her gaze fixed on the distance. She was alone. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was not a formal encounter. This was chance. Or fate. He walked towards her, his boots crunching on the fallen leaves. She heard him and turned. Her face, for a moment, was unguarded, and he saw a flash of something raw and yearning in her eyes before the familiar composure slid back into place. "Julian," she said, "I didn't expect to see you here." "Nor I you," he said, stopping a few feet away. "May I sit?" She nodded, and he settled onto the log beside her, leaving a careful space between them. The wind rustled the last of the golden leaves overhead. "I come here often," she said softly, not looking at him. "It's peaceful." "It is," he agreed. He looked at her profile, the straight nose, the determined set of her jaw. The words he had been rehearsing for weeks felt clumsy and inadequate. He abandoned them. "I am miserable," he said. She turned to him, startled. "What?" "I am utterly, completely miserable," he repeated. "I have everything I thought I wanted. My land is secure. My honor is intact. I am married to the most remarkable woman I have ever known, and I have never been so lonely in my life." Her eyes widened. "Julian." "I made you a promise, Nell," he continued, the words tumbling out now, unstoppable. "I promised you your freedom. I promised not to presume. I have kept that promise, and it is destroying me. I don't want a marriage of convenience. I don't want a wife in name only. I want you, all of you. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to argue with you about crop rotation over breakfast. I want to hold your hand when we walk through these fields. I want to hear you laugh, that real laugh, every single day, for the rest of my life." He took her hand, and she did not pull away. Her fingers were cold, and he wrapped them tightly in his own. "I love you, Nell," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I love your strength and your stubbornness. I love the way you talk to your tenants, the way you examine a sheep, the way you look at a sunset. I love you, and I'm asking you, not as a duke to a lady, not as a husband to a wife by law, but as a man to a woman. Will you have me? Not as a partner in a legal contract, but as a partner in life. Will you let me love you?" He fell silent, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure she could hear it. The wind whispered through the trees. A bird called in the distance. And Nell looked at him, her storm-grey eyes brimming with tears. "You foolish, wonderful man," she whispered, and then she laughed, that beautiful, unrestrained laugh, and it was the most glorious sound he had ever heard. "Do you think I come to this log, to this place where we first truly talked, to think about sheep?" He stared at her, hope flaring painfully in his chest. "I love you, Julian," she said, the words falling like warm rain on his parched soul. "I think I have loved you since the moment you apologized to me in that field. But I was so afraid. I was afraid that if I let you in, I would lose myself. I didn't realize that I was only half a person without you." He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "You could never lose yourself," he said fiercely. "You are the strongest person I know. I don't want to own you, Nell. I want to stand beside you. I want us to be a team." "A team," she repeated, a radiant smile breaking through her tears. "I like the sound of that." And then there were no more words. He closed the small distance between them and kissed her. It was not the gentle, chaste kiss of their wedding day. It was a kiss of promise, of passion, of two souls finally finding their home. It was a kiss that spoke of a future built not on contracts and convenience, but on love, freely given and joyfully received. The years that followed were the happiest either of them could have imagined. They divided their time between Northridge and Thornwood, but in truth, the boundaries between the estates soon became meaningless. They managed the lands as one, combining Julian's grand vision with Nell's intimate, practical knowledge. The Eastern farm became a showcase of their partnership, thriving under their combined care. Nell was not just the Duchess of Northridge, she was its heart. She established a school for the tenant children, organised a system of support for families in need, and was known and loved by every soul on the estate. Julian, in turn, became a fixture at Thornwood, learning the name of every cow and the history of every family, just as she had. They were seen walking the fields together at all hours, deep in conversation, their heads bent close, a portrait of perfect companionship. They had children, a son who would one day be the 7th Duke, and 2 daughters who inherited their mother's stormy eyes and their father's determined spirit. They were raised to understand that land was a trust, not a possession, and that people mattered more than profit. And on the anniversary of their first meeting, Julian would always take Nell back to the fallen log at the edge of the wood. They would sit there, watching the sun set over the land they loved, the land they had built together. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked her one such evening, many years later. "Signing that contract? Marrying a stranger?" She leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture as natural as breathing. "I don't think of it as a contract anymore," she said, her voice soft with contentment. "I think of it as the universe's most roundabout way of giving me exactly what I never knew I wanted." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "And what is that?" She tilted her head back to look at him, her stormy eyes filled with a lifetime of love. "You," she said simply. "A partner, a home, not a place, but a person." She smiled, that radiant smile that still made his heart turn over after all these years. "I thought I had to choose between independence and love. You showed me I could have both." Julian pulled her closer, gazing out at the fields that stretched before them, his land, her land, their land, all boundaries blurred into one beautiful whole. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and he knew, with a certainty that surpassed all logic, that this was exactly where he was meant to be. "I love you, Duchess," he murmured against her hair. "And I love you, Duke," she whispered back. "Always." The wind carried their words away across the fields, weaving them into the very soil, into the hedgerows and the harvests, into the generations that would come after. A contract written by dead men had become a love story written by 2 living hearts, and it was only just beginning. The end. Thank you, dear reader of the Regency Gazette, for joining us in another tale of love, intrigue, and whispered ballroom secrets. If today's romance delighted you, kindly bestow a like upon this video. It helps our Gazette reach more lovers of Regency storytelling. For weekly journeys into dukes, debutantes, scandals, and slow-burning devotion, please subscribe to the Gazette and tap the little bell so you are notified the moment the next story is published. Until our next edition, may your days be filled with grace and your nights with the promise of romance.